on the subject, I'll leave it to you, Taina, to introduce her.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. So we are delighted to have Professor Jennifer Klein join us this evening from Hunter's School of Education. Professor Klein is super humble, so she probably doesn't want me to read her whole bio, but I'll just give some highlights. Professor Klein began her teaching career in the late 90s in Brooklyn. She's been serving in New York and New Jersey schools in a wide range of roles ever since. She's also an active parent volunteer. She got her master's from the Teachers College at Columbia, where she was the recipient of a prestigious fellowship that gave her the opportunity to focus on research on effective literacy intervention strategies for struggling readers, which I know has been of a lot of importance to local parents and families concerned about their kids struggling and falling behind over the past year in the pandemic learning from home. Professor Klein has supervised graduate students in literacy at the Dean Hope Center for Educational and Psychological Services at Columbia. She taught at the William Patterson University as well. And in the Learning Disabilities Program at the School of Ed at Hunter, which is here in our community district. Professor Klein teaches and coordinates method courses in reading, writing, math K through 6, and she's also the K through 6 administrator for the Hunter College Learning Lab, which is an after-school clinical tutoring program that serves the needs of children with learning disabilities. I believe Professor Klein will tell us a little bit more about that shortly. She has been the recipient of many awards, and she is the Ed TPA coordinator for the Department of Special Ed, and she serves on the Ed TPA task force for the State Education Department. So we're incredibly honored to have you here with us, Professor Klein. As we mentioned in preparation for this call, we have had many conversations over the past, months and year, and heard from a lot of parents and educators in the neighborhood that have so many concerns about what's happening to our students and our children, and sort of how we come out on the other side of this. So we're really excited to have you here and look forward to hearing from you, and then to have you taking some questions from folks.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Taina and Peter and the whole community board for having me and for that very kind introduction. As an educator, as someone who was actually sick with COVID for all of November, and a mother of 2 public school students, one of whom was also sick with COVID this year, both of whom were out of in-person school for well over a year and actually only just returned to 2 half days a week last month. I so share your concern. I so share your sentiment. And I'm so grateful to be part of what I hope will be an ongoing conversation with others who are active in the community and invested in conceptualizing a smart and thoughtful approach to COVID recovery and the best education possible for all children. This evening, I think I have about an hour or 45 minutes or something with you, and I hope to first share a bit about myself, my work supporting students in the community who attend the Hunter College Learning Lab for academic support, what I know about the research so far related to COVID and education and the impact on education. And I'll also just share a few personal things because a lot of the time when I'm talking with parents, it comes down to what are you doing with your own kids, right? What are your plans for your own children? So I will share what my own plan is for my daughters, who are currently twins in the 7th grade. Well, they'll always be twins, but they're currently in the 7th grade and entering 8th grade next fall. And finally, I hope to share some helpful, free or low cost resources for those who are looking for some extra support for their children. So Taina, I think you have a link to a handout that I put together. Yes. You want to share that in the chat?
Sure. This is Max now. I actually have that, and Taina sent it to me. I will share it momentarily.
Great. Thanks so much. Also related to the chat, as questions come up, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll address them as best I can, either as we go or in about 15, 20 minutes. Max, Rami, Taina, Peter, feel free to stop me if you need clarification on anything as I'm speaking. My hope is that this conversation will be interactive and collaborative, and that the work will be proactive in nature moving forward. So again, I'm imagining that I'll speak for about 15, 20, and then we can open up the virtual floor, so to speak, to your ideas and questions. And if I start to talk longer than 20 minutes, please stop me. Okay, so first a bit about me, so you understand my lens and my role in education. I was born and raised in Baltimore, but moved here at 17 for college and then later grad school. I am a former New York City public school elementary school teacher. I am a reading specialist certified in New York State to work with children grades K to 12. And now, as you mentioned, I'm a teacher educator at Hunter College. I have also worked with adults who experience learning loss for a variety of reasons on literacy-based difficulties. In my role as a professor in the School of Education at Hunter College, I teach beginning teachers how to teach math, writing, and reading to kids in grades K to 6 who are struggling academically and who have experienced what many watching or many here tonight would call some loss of learning for a variety of reasons. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about how to support children without diminishing their spirit or their love of learning, which I think is very innate if we don't stifle it. And I believe that at the core of teaching must be the strong social fabric of learning communities, and that prioritizing the needs of the individual child must come before both the content and the data. And I will get back to the data in a minute. So I mentioned that I coordinate the Hunter College Learning Lab. A bit more about the Learning Lab. It's actually a free on-site tutoring program out of Hunter College at 68th Street and Lexington, but we also have off-site locations out of public schools around New York City. And the Learning Lab serves the needs of children with individualized education plans or IEPs in grades K to 12. And the model that we use is students meet with a graduate student twice a week after school for 75 minutes. And we utilize what is called a diagnostic teaching model to support children's academic growth, their motivation, their self-determination, and very importantly, their confidence. It's a model that I think is really useful and really helpful for conceptualizing how to work with children who have fallen behind due to COVID or other issues, or who just are struggling with mastery of specific academic skills. So before I get into the data and the research, which I shared some links to on the handout, and I know folks are very interested in this, I want to caution us all about focusing too much on loss or deficits in our kids, because giving students deficit-based labels has pretty predictable negative outcomes. And it's very critical that we focus on all of the strengths that all of our students bring to school. I really don't love to remediate students to death, and I don't love to over-test. I don't think either work very effectively. And I think that norm reference tests, while they're useful in looking at a big picture, they shouldn't be used in isolation to inform practice with individual children who are all so unique and different from each other. And we want to, whenever possible, let student interests and experiences and their assets drive instruction. We want to provide choice and support teachers with time to plan together and discuss specific students and their progress. And I think come fall, of course, continue to rebuild community and a sense of safety so that kids can focus on learning. When you look at the research, you'll see that large-scale norm-referenced assessments are used to monitor national progress and sometimes international progress, right? This is not the kind of assessment data that we use to customize intervention plans in the Learning Lab. So the data that you see provided by most norm reference tests and assessments that you see cited in the COVID research on learning loss is useful for research and it's useful for getting a big picture, but it's not specific enough to teach to. And I'm a what next kind of person, right? As a practitioner, I'm really interested in thinking about, okay, what are we going to do for individual children? And it's, I guess, analogous. I know I have some high school students here. It's almost analogous to using an SAT score to try and plan an engaging unit, right? It's just not how you do it. So a better way of measuring learning gains and a better way of planning for instruction for kids who have fallen behind is for teachers to use a pre-assessment that aligns specifically to class curriculum or to essential skills that underlie reading and math, rather than to a broad type of SAT or MAP test or other large-scale district assessment that gives you a broad data picture. So for example, as a reading specialist, I might get a child's assessment score, right, on a state reading assessment, but it won't be specific enough to teach to. I would need to get to know the child and read with them and see if their reading level, if it were stalled, if it's stalled because of a lack of strategy use, because it's stalled, see if it's stalled because of perhaps phonics skills or fluency, perhaps a lack of vocabulary, a lack of inferential comprehension, maybe test anxiety, or maybe even cognitive and concentration issues as a result of trauma. So those norm reference test scores don't give us a specific enough picture to plan for instruction. I just came from playing tennis, so a sports analogy might be helpful here. And I find a lot of my kids respond well to a sports analogy. I missed more than a year of tennis due to COVID. And my very good coach gave me a quick and informal pre-assessment to determine my level and my specific skills-based needs before he began coaching me again, right? So he did not automatically assume that there was a deficit in my breathing due to the fact that I was sick in November. He also did not assume that I was exactly where I left off. So he began by watching and by looking and with quick informal assessment. And good classroom teaching and good intervention follows a similar model. We don't make assumptions based on global numbers because all children are unique individuals with their own assets and needs. And so we want to be sure to look carefully at our kids as individuals before we plan for intervention. So in the Learning Lab, we conduct our own assessments and we utilize an asset-based lens. What does this look like? It means we are not going to torture children on their multiplication facts if they are already fluent with multiplication, right? Instead, we want to maximize time and joy and really develop a love of learning. And as important as finding someone's weakness is finding what sparks joy and interest, we really want them to want to come back to school, right? And want them to come back to tutoring. So my take is supported by the research, in addition to my own teaching experience, is that informal assessments conducted by classroom teachers, math specialists, and reading specialists will be key to organizing extra support for those students who need it. And finding the time and resources for students who demonstrate specific needs in literacy or in math, will benefit from one-to-one or small group tutoring or extra time working with a teacher or paraprofessional. The research that I linked in the handout suggests that school-aligned tutoring from a highly trained teacher or aide, ideally one-to-one, but also can work in a small group, can help students who are behind catch up academically. And the hope is that these services could be paid for with stimulus dollars from Washington. Any questions before I move into talking about more of the research? No? Okay. So we know that existing differences in academic achievement, language fluency and ability, as well as inequity in technology and internet access and other resources were amplified as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19's impact was disproportionately greater for Black, Hispanic, and Native American students than for their white and Asian peers, and also disproportionately higher for English language learners and students with disabilities. Newer studies that have come out in the last few months actually show that on the whole, students, especially white upper middle class students, made more gains than were originally predicted in math and reading during the pandemic. And I specify math and reading because those are the two things that were measured, right? Not everything can be measured by a norm-based assessment. And so we're talking about math and reading gains specifically. And I saw that in the minutes of your last meeting, the research on summer learning came up and on summer learning loss. Achievements as measured by math and reading assessment does typically slow over the summer months. And declines tend to be steeper for math than reading. And the extent proportionally of loss in math actually increases in the upper grades. So what does this mean for me in my personal life? It means that when I am investing money in tutoring for my own children who are entering 8th grade, I've invested in math tutoring. And my own kids do math tutoring at least once or twice a week. Do they love it? No. Does the research tell me that it's important? Yes. So they're going to keep doing it, even though their grades are good right now. So the issue with summer comparisons is that they don't take into account much of the actually very good teaching that schools have provided virtually. So all of that summer research that was cited as a predictor of what the impact of COVID might be and the impact of COVID learning loss was based on a period of time where there isn't virtual learning. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at the research. Much of the virtual instruction has been quite good and quite effective. We know that there are discrepancies in terms of quality across different groups, especially for kids who don't have access to high-speed internet. But much of the instruction has been good and effective. So one of the studies reviewed that I shared on the handout actually found that students in grades 1 through 8, their scores rose during the first half of the 2020-21 school year. So they, on the whole, did make academic progress during COVID-19. And the amount of progress made was similar to what Renaissance, the organization that synthesized the research, would expect in a non-pandemic year. In terms of the specific data reported in math, on average, students score 6 percentile rank points below their expected performance, which means that a student whose past performance would have indicated that they should have been average in winter or around the 50th percentile in math based on pre-pandemic norms might now be at the 44th percentile in math. The difference was smaller in reading, about 2 percentile rank points, which is not so statistically significant. That said, and the data is very mixed. The data looked different in middle school. Reading in grades 6 through 8, they noticed that the gap widened just a bit. So what are next steps? It's really going to depend on the needs of your child. I think for many students, time away from the screen is going to be really important this summer, with opportunity to move, to connect with the outdoors and with their friends, and with their bodies, and to socialize, right, with family and other children. For others, a few sessions a week of literacy or math-based extra support could definitely ensure a more successful start to the fall. I mentioned that I am doing once or twice a week of math tutoring for my own children, and I'll probably continue that when they aren't at sleepaway camp over the summer. So when they're at home, that would continue. But the rest for my family is going to be camp, sports, arts, and socializing. I did provide some resources on the handout for folks who are looking for summer opportunities. What I would encourage you to do before you secure extra academic support for your kids is to talk with their classroom teacher, talk with your own child if they're at an age where that's developmentally appropriate, right? And see what they think. If your child's grades are good, if they're feeling relatively confident, right? Maybe academic support isn't the urgent need for this summer. If their teacher thinks that they would benefit from extra support, there are free programs, right? Or sliding scale programs that could be really helpful, including NYC DOE Summer Rising. So all public school students are able to apply for the Summer Rising program, which focuses on readiness skills for the next grade, combined with social and emotional support and activities in the afternoon. And something that I love about this program is they're doing field trips on Fridays. So it seems like they are really attending to a need to address, the whole child, right? And not just this concept of academic deficit. My program, the Hunter College Learning Lab, resumes in fall, and we offer tuition-free virtual and in-person tutoring for students with IEPs or individualized education plans in grades 1 through 12. And you can reach out to me or reach out to our admissions coordinator, Carol Deere, if you're interested in learning more about that. There is the Dean Hope Center for Educational and Psychological Services out of Columbia University, and they offer fantastic sliding scale psychological and educational services to individuals, couples, and families living in New York City. Those services are provided by supervised graduate students. There is the Boys Club, which provides more than 40 engaging and inclusive programs designed to support members as they grow into men of character. Of course, I'm quoting the Boys Club here. Anyway, there's additional resources on the handout. And so I encourage you to do some research and see what's right for you and your family. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Klein. That was extraordinarily helpful. So I just want to open it up. I don't know if Peter or Rami want to start with any questions, and then we can open it up to board members and members of the public.
Well, first, I'll make a few comments. First of all, I love what you said, and I love the positive frame that you come from, and in terms of looking at it, and that makes a world of sense to me. At the same time, I mean, one of the questions I ask myself is, okay, I'm one member of the community. I have concerns about all of our kids, Upper East Side and everywhere else in the city. And I mean, I'm a huge fan. Quick sidebar. I discovered about 15 years ago, I'm really a teacher, been teaching at the college level in business and economics. But I actually think education in primary school is a lot more important than that, for our kids and even preschool. So I don't know if you have thoughts on the subject, but I'd like to think about how we could increase the level of community support, locally or even citywide, to provide more resources, to all of our schools and all of our kids. And I'll be waving a little flag to that effect, whether or not it's effective. But I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah. So Peter, I think all kids deserve great teachers from preschool to grad school. And so your teaching is just as important as mine or anyone else's. And for those of us who are lifelong learners, right, we all deserve fantastic teachers as we age as well. I love taking classes and I continue to love learning, right, as an adult. I think in terms of one of the best things that we could do for schools and communities is make sure that there are an abundance of reading specialists and math specialists on hand. So classroom teachers, I mean, the day of a classroom teacher, it is just incredibly overwhelming, right? And so if we really want kids to get customized, individualized support, we're going to need more hands on deck. And I think increased staffing from math specialists, from reading specialists, and then also psychologists, right? Folks who can help support just the trauma that kids have been through would be an incredible use of resources.
I'm putting it on my list. Thank you.
Yeah, people, right? There's no replacement for people, right? We can invest in high-end technology. I mean, we saw that happen in Newark, right? We can invest in brand new books, but if we don't have highly trained people to mediate those materials and to see kids and to meet kids and welcome children at the door, we really can't maximize use of any of those things or that stuff, right?
But just picking up on what you just said, I did begin looking at some of the materials you provided, and I find them quite interesting. And my number one takeaway, I guess, is along the lines we're just speaking, which is sort of the extent that we can find the resources available to do it, the individualized, specialized tutoring, maybe a couple days a week, particularly by trained professionals, not necessarily, well-meaning amateurs coming in,
Yeah.
Is at least a big part of the story. And so you have me thinking about that. And thank you for that.
Absolutely. And even well-trained amateurs, right? When we can't, obviously we want high-trained certified professionals when we can, but just, for kids having a concerned adult with some basic training, right? Especially for kids who really have high needs, right? That one-to-one support and interest from any adult can make a huge difference. I mean, that's one of the reasons that, the Big Brother, Big Sister program has been just so effective because just the presence of a concerned adult in a child's life can make a world of difference. But of course, yeah, when we're talking about educational outcomes in math and reading, the more highly trained professionals we have, the better. And the smaller the groups, the better. I'm also a big proponent of 2 teachers in every classroom. I, personally did my best teaching when someone else was watching me. It just is what it is, right? When we're being observed, we rise to be our best selves. I also learned my best teaching from watching others. I just don't think teaching is something that should happen in isolation. And if you think about early childhood or being in a kindergarten classroom or a first grade classroom, I mean, you have a child who, has an accident, let's say, the teacher has to attend to the child who needs to use the bathroom, and you've got 25 other children who are virtually unsupervised. I mean, none of us can handle 25 children effectively by ourselves, right? And so, yeah, just human capital. I think if we can provide more hands in the classrooms, it's going to make a lot of difference.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm going to pause and see if there are other people who have questions they'd like to pose.
I'll go, but if someone else has a question, I'll yield. So a little bit adding on to Peter's last question. So we see that small gap in reading in that percentile difference, but overall, pre-pandemic, we were seeing deficits in reading across the board. And correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the stuff I was looking at about that was just even a little bit of extra enrichment outside of school, like someone to actually sit down and read with a child or have the child read to them went a long way. So, and you were talking about skill level there. So would a high school student that is trained, of course, we're not just putting anyone with our kindergartners and our first graders, but would a high school student be able to be that person to just sit and get read to, like a therapy dog or one of those, the library does them?
Yeah. The research tells us that the vocabulary, even in children's picture books, right? Beginning picture books, is more sophisticated than the language that people with advanced degrees use in everyday conversation, right? So vocabulary growth, Rami, is incredibly dependent on both reading, but also, as you're saying, and as you're suggesting, being read to, right? So absolutely anyone who can read fluently, if they can read aloud to a younger person, there are tremendous benefits. And there's a huge correlation between vocabulary and reading comprehension, of course, because if you have a wider vocabulary knowledge, you're going to understand more of what you read. We know there is a huge vocabulary gap between upper middle class students and students living in poverty, right? So just as you suggest, even if you had high school students reading to low income children and talking about those read alouds together regularly, right? Absolutely, that could have impact. And even, middle school, high school kids having adults read aloud, right, to older children, and then using it as an opportunity to discuss and talk about the content, right, that you're reading about, will increase vocabulary knowledge. It also increases connectedness, right, that human experience that comes from reading. So yeah, I think that's a great idea, and it's really important. Read alouds have so much research support.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Curious if others have questions.
The other thing I want to mention is, just because, summer's coming, board games, right? For those math skills, the Monopoly, chess, all of those board games that we used to play, before our kids got the screens in front of them. There's actually a lot of research support for those games supporting math skill development, right? And critical thinking. So, all of those kind of family opportunities to play board games, play Monopoly, read aloud together, read the newspaper together, read a chapter book together, play cards, play, war with a card deck. All of those things are a way to address the need to rebuild social connectedness while also building life skills and academic skills. Well, thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Professor
having me.
Klein.
Yeah, folks, feel free to email me if you have any additional questions. And I look forward to being in touch.
Thank you
Actually,
so much. Go ahead.
if I can I just jump in for a second? Because everything you're saying actually is sort of reaching different sort of cells in my consciousness. I mean, the games, I mean, I don't want you to go quite so quickly, if that's okay.
Oh, I'm happy to stay. I just didn't want to keep talking at you.
Oh, I love it. I'll add one thought. We just spent some time today with one of my wife's oldest friends from like 9th grade, a woman named Marley Kaplan. And she'd gone to business school and she'd gone to investment banking. And then I've lost track of how long ago, at least 20 years ago, probably longer. She went over and started running something called Chess in the Schools. And it was focused on, on the poorer, less advantaged schools,
Yeah.
Bronx, throughout the city. And I'm just trying to think. I believe she took one team to Moscow, for an international chess competition. I know she took another team down to the White House, and meet people there. And then at her annual event, you'd hear these kids talk. And I have to tell you, I mean, I don't know what I should have expected, but I was impressed.
Yeah.
These are kids that are, thoughtful and it develops skill sets. I mean, otherwise I wouldn't have any particular reason, I mean, out of ignorance, really, to assume what skills they did or didn't have.
So amazing. And Peter, those are skills that are not measured by standardized tests, right? The critical thinking, and the sportsmanship and the spatial reasoning and thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead, right? And learning how to hold something in your working memory. As you get better at chess, right, you develop capacity to do that. It's all so important. And then importantly, that community building, right, that your friend was doing. Yeah.
I mean, at its peak, I mean, they were up to 20,000 students a year, which is a large number. It's actually not necessarily large in relation to the whole New York City school system, but it's a huge impact on a large number of kids, giving them opportunities that they otherwise wouldn't have had. And also, the next thing, I'm teasing you now, but the next thing you would mention is taking them out of their frame of reference into discovering larger possibilities, larger opportunities, seeing themselves in relation to, just sort of a larger world out there, is a contribution also.
Absolutely. And that's why I got so excited that this summer remedial program is doing field trips on Fridays, right? Because that really should be a critical part of learning, right? Travel, experiencing new places, seeing other opportunities. I had a landlady once, and when I lived in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, who told me she'd never been to Manhattan. And so she lived just across the bridge her whole life. I think maybe she'd gone like once for a funeral or a doctor's appointment or something, but she had never taken advantage of the museums. She had never, met people outside of her Williamsburg Italian culture. And that fascinated me, that in New York City, you could have access to so much, but without someone guiding you, it can be hard to take advantage of, right?
Professor Klein, if I can jump in.
Go, please.
Our fellow community board member, Vanessa Aronson, she has a little baby boy. I think she's trying to put him to sleep, so she doesn't want to speak up. But she texted me a question to ask you, which was about early childhood education specifically. So Vanessa would like to know what we know, if anything, about gains during the pandemic for 3K and pre-K.
Games during the pandemic.
Gains.
Oh, gains.
Yeah.
I have to ask my early childhood colleagues about that. But in early childhood, I mean, rhyming, talking, singing, play-based activities, relationship with family, language development, right? Coordination, like holding things, picking things up. so that the assessments that we use to measure early childhood gains are different from the data that I was just referencing. We wouldn't have, the reading and the math data, obviously, which is probably where the nature of the question comes from. I don't know how early childhood has been impacted in terms of the data. I do know that parents of young children who have been trying to both care for their young children while also work, right, have been under tremendous stress. And I don't know if or how that has impacted young children. I hope not, but I think the stress probably has.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask just one other question, and only if this is readily available or if there's some outside resource on this, to identify tutoring programs in which lay people like myself could actually participate. Is there a resource you're aware of, or a website, or how would one explore that?
Into that, Peter, and we can be in touch to share, because I think it depends on the city and the state, the quality. Some public libraries train folks to do literacy-based tutoring interventions, but I can certainly get you some resources. And you also have an open invitation to come to Hunter and observe if you want to see how we do it.
Oh, you're going to
Peter's going to take you up on that.
on that one very quickly. That excites me. I'm looking forward to that already.
Oh, it's great.
Now those opportunities, I assume the current semester is more over than not. I mean, would this also be programs during the summer that one can?
Yeah, I just actually submitted my grades before I got on.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So this is my little celebration. So we are not doing summer interventions. Certainly many programs are. We are going to resume with tutoring in, we train our teachers in September. We start our tutoring in October. And because of COVID, we're planning to do a hybrid model, which is once a week in person and once a week online. So we just want to be prepared for both. We'd like to get face-to-face time if possible, but we also want to train teachers to teach effectively online before something happens.
Got it. Right.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments, anybody? I'm going to say I've been thrilled. I mean, you just what you've conveyed to me is like opening up a whole new world of possibilities and opportunities. And
I'm so glad. I mean, that's the beauty of education, right? If we go into it with that asset-based lens, and so much is possible, right?
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Klein. I think I promised we'd try to get you out in 45 minutes. So I really appreciate it. Again, I think I can echo what Peter said. I think we, none of us are experts or educators really. And, I think it was easy for us to sort of fall into the habit of thinking about this, frankly, from a deficit-based perspective. So it was really refreshing to get your perspective. And I think we learned a ton, and I'm sure we will definitely share the slide that you sent us and put it on our website so that parents and educators in the community have access. And I'm sure we'll take you up on visiting in the fall.
Great. Stay in touch. Stay well.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, Peter, do you want to take us to our next item on the agenda?
Actually, I've got to tell you, I'm having a little technical problem, and I don't have in front of me what the next item is supposed to do. Can you help me out?
Yeah, sure. So the next item we were going to discuss was education issues pertaining to the blood center proposal, in particular impacts to the Julie Richmond Education Complex. Yeah.
Thank you. You're really
welcome. You're very welcome.
So this is an open conversation. Anybody that wants to make a thought or a comment or a contribution. But the basic point is, as Taina just mentioned, those of us on the community board have had a lot of attention on this blood bank proposal. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be neutral, but I'm definitely not good at being neutral on this particular proposal. It seems to be totally out of context, out of scale, in the wrong neighborhood. I mean, the basic concept, no one's against the blood bank, no one's against research, no one's even against commercial, research in biology or biotech arenas. But the point to look at, to the extent that there's an appetite and interest, is the degree to which a multi-year, construction project across the street from the Julia Richmond complex, and then ongoing additional sort of traffic congestion and so on, not to mention the issues of shadows on the school and on the playground down the street, are certainly concerning to many of us. So I think what I'm just going to do is ask, are there people who'd like to have thoughts on that, would like to comment on that? And it's certainly possible, or if there's interest to consider some kind of sort of resolution expressing our concern on the impacts of that proposed project on on education for all of our students, our families, and especially the Julie Richmond complex. Ed, I see you have some thoughts.
Hi, Peter. Well, no more than I've shared before at the previous two meetings we had this month. I mean, I'm, just in terms of, relative to this committee, I think, it does bother me. I mean, you look at the size of that building, scope-wise, just at a higher level. And I just think about the shadows again on St. Catherine's Park. I know a lot of kids go there. And to hear the stories about being in school in shadows all day long, I mean, it's a real drag. I mean, I know I worked one of my first jobs. We didn't have windows. We were actually in a former steam room in the Canon office building. It used to be the members' steam room. They just put carpeting over the walls, but there were no windows. So, I mean, I remember that was not exact. I mean, you go outside and all that kind of thing. But anyway, the point is, the shadows is something. But one thing I didn't say last night, that I was listening to the presentation the other day, I guess it was 2 nights ago. I was struck by the enormity of the project and what they were going to be doing to be staging that on 66. I used to live on 66, but between 2nd and 3rd. And that's one of the few blocks, it may be the only block in Manhattan that has its own sort of like private two-way. It's 2 ways on that block in 66 between 2nd and 3rd. But it's a very narrow street, and it's, the transverse for the west side. So it's a lot of action, and, just the practicality of it. Yeah, yes, okay, we can live with it, please. Again, stating the obvious. Of course we can live with it. Of course we can freaking endure it. Of course we can pretty much put up with anything. I just kind of wonder the effect long-term, 5 years, kids. You just got done with 10 years of the 2nd Avenue subway, not far away from the same spot. I don't know. I mean, that's just sort of just some general observations. In terms of like a resolution or something, I don't know, that to me, that seems almost redundant, because we already as a board, we're against this, and, again, to be obvious, but
No, you seem towards the end of your paragraph, and I'm open to anyone else commenting, because it's not my style to dominate until my mouth starts going, and then I have trouble stopping. Does anyone else like to make a comment? Okay, good. Well, here comes at least 1 or 2 paragraphs. And it's just a reflection on the conversation and the presentation yesterday. One of the things that sort of surprised me, bordering on shocked me, was, the question of what kind of analysis and what kind of alternatives they looked at. And the attorney speaking, I won't even get into his name, but the attorney speaking on behalf of the project, basically posited, here's what the community board wants, and they want it to be as of right and therefore limited in terms of height to the 75 feet or, and the alternative seems to be something 335 feet, which is, I was pretty good at arithmetic years ago. But I think that's a pretty significant difference. And then looking at that particular issue, well, he did point out that they looked at one alternative at 170 feet, which would be what, a bit more than double the as of right height, but about half of what's actually proposed. And his only comment was, they looked at that, but it didn't satisfy their criteria. Now, what I would have liked to have asked, and what I may ask if we have another such session is, well, tell me, what were their criteria? I mean, as I pointed out, and I apologize to all of you, but the standard test said I was supposed to become an attorney. But my father was an attorney, and I didn't like my sense of the politics of law firms, so I went my own route, and I studied business and economics and got into teaching business and economics. But that leads to some pretty obvious questions. What is the economic analysis of this project? What kind of returns is and I'm going to say investor looking at? Because I think, as far as I can tell, they're looking at it, I'm going to say predominantly, but I think almost exclusively in economic terms. There's no indication of what particular kinds of commercial clients might take up the commercial space. There's no, sort of, at least evidence developed of particular kinds of clients who are, need that space and couldn't take space that's a half a dozen blocks or more away. My fairly simplistic assumption, but I respect this. In a competitive private economy, people are looking to make returns. And therefore, I assume that the premise of that statement is whatever returns that Longfellow is looking for out of this project, we're better satisfied at 335 feet than 170 feet. Well, with all due respect to people listening, I find that borderline outrageous, and absolutely no indication that they looked at anything in between, which obviously would reduce some of those negative impacts, particularly on St. Catherine's Park, and so on, and probably to some degree reduce the time frame for development. So I'm what can I say? I'm going to try to be generous and say I'm unsympathetic and unimpressed by the degree to which the developer shows any interest or concern about the impacts on the community. And frankly, that brings to mind a word in my thought process called outrage. I don't know if anyone else has comments they want to share, but that's where I am. I guess I'm the only one interested in opining on that subject. Do any of my co-chairs, even a sentence or two, and it's perfectly fine to be coming from a different place.
Yeah, I think, I just feel like this is like a little bit of beating a dead horse. I feel like we've made our opinion clear almost unanimously as a board, frankly. So
if the horse were dead, I'd feel better about it, but keep going.
The horse is not dead yet, Peter, but I do think, if we hadn't just passed the resolution, again, almost was unanimous, I'd feel differently, but I think that, I think it's sort of obvious that part of our concerns have to do with the impact to Julia Richmond and St. Catherine's Park. But, I welcome, the opportunity to hear from folks in the public. I don't know if there are members of the public here that wanted to speak specifically or are from the Julia Richmond community that we could hear from, but that's just my 2 cents on a resolution. I think we've stated our case as a board about our concerns, and I think those concerns include the impact to kids in the neighborhood.
No, and I'll echo that. I think that you're right. It is. I feel like the problem's been dealt with to the extent that we can on whatever today's May 27th, 2021 at whatever 7:30 in the evening. There's next steps in the Euler process. It's not going away. We know that, and they made it clear that they're not making this go away. So I'm sure they'll be back with something else. But for the time being, I think that we made that case earlier this week, whenever that vote was. Yeah.
Well, in that case, I'm going to bring up one other point, and you can beat me if you want. This is now a within the family conversation. So I certainly don't take offense. I hope, I trust no one else on the, listening in takes offense. Last night we had this session, for the task force looking at this new planning process, and my somewhat simplified understanding of the process, and I do respect the notion of comprehensive planning. I certainly respect the concept of sustainability. I think those are actually enormously important concepts. The question, however, is what's the impact of this new process going to be on decision making? And as again, I mentioned before, one member of the community board who remained nameless, but I will say this person is very much pro-development. His concern on this particular issue was that this would create a planning czar. And I am absolutely convinced, and I open to anyone want to challenging it, with a planning czar, I think there is less likelihood that we could effectively press back against either the blood center, if that was deemed to be consistent with some citywide interest and objective, and this notion of creating a cluster, around life sciences. I know I'm sort of losing my train of thought, but I find it very sort of challenging to try to imagine that there's going to be more consideration to community concerns, and it bothers me because it's basically institutionalizing a process that's going to basically empower one party heavily influenced by two parties, the mayor and the speaker of the city council, and making these decisions that'll override community interests. And again, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you a little piece of personal history. I'm Vietnam era. I got arrested twice. Once was at the Boston Army base, and that was my expression of concern. I did walked around the White House in what we called one night the March Against Death, because we thought that was a problematic. The whole Vietnam War was a problematic. I consider this problematic also, and very much against the interests of the community. And it disappoints me in a serious way that people that I like and respect and admire, including our own representative on the city council,
don't come from Brooklyn.
End of soliloquy. Anyone else care to comment? And I'm comfortable with the thought that there's not a lot of appetite, at least that I hear, for adding additional resolution. Go ahead, Ed.
Well, I was just going to say, I share your concern, Peter, in terms of like the willy-nilly sort of pell-mell approach to land use, decision-making, and development in the city, the 5 boroughs. And, it's funny, I was just thinking about, maybe just a geek, maybe I was just on the bike and it was 45 minutes and the TV wasn't on. So, but I was thinking about the process and, trying to do land use and having a comprehensive, I know the City Club and some of these other, the Municipal Arts Society and all of these organizations, a lot of folks, a lot of degrees, a lot of academic credentials involved in these groups, giving a lot of thought to this in terms of regional planning and all the things you talk about in grad school. But, God, just the politics of it in the 5 boroughs of New York at 8.5 million people, God, I wonder if it's even possible to do a comprehensive plan for the city of New York, given just the disparate interests and just even, from a housing committee standpoint, not, to shift the focus, but anecdotally, just from a housing perspective, getting some of the other committees on the island of Manhattan, community boards, I was surprised over the past few years, how disparate the views are just in the island of Manhattan, just on housing issues. And it's just, again, you just sort of, I don't know, there's no real point here, just more observations, just thinking about how difficult that is in terms of land use and planning just within one particular borough, but then to try to do that citywide, 5 boroughs, throw in, the political layer on top of that and, the interested stake in terms of land use and development, i.e. big real estate, i.e. the trade unions, the weight that they bring to the process. I guess where I'm going with all of this long diatribe is for all of its shortcomings, I don't know, I don't know how we fix it, you know, given what we have, and I don't want to just throw our hands up in the air, but it's quite a conundrum. I'll just end it by that. But you know, I'm
Well,
with you. Quite a conundrum.
I'd like to make one comment. I see Vanessa. I don't know if you're interested in making a comment. I'd love to hear it. But I'm going to make one comment, which is the notion of comprehensive planning, the notion of focusing on sustainability. I mean, to me, it's very hard to argue against those. The question is, what would the process look like? And I have a very simple notion. I did take a look at the East Harlem plan. I thought it was very interesting. It was a community process led to community expression of sort of points of view and values and concerns in terms of how they'd like to see their community developed. And I think that would be a hugely beneficial process. I'd be delighted to be a part of it. And it could inform the larger decision making without being, you know, sort of ultimately determinative of outcomes. I think that would be useful. I mean, more information in decision making is only a plus, and getting more engagement and participation of different points of view is only a plus. And I'm seeing Vanessa, and I'm hoping you want to say something, but it's really up to you. I should not even say that. That's really unfair of me. But I'm a little brother. I'm unfair sometimes.
You know, sorry, am I unmuted now? I think.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
I didn't join yesterday's meeting, so I don't know what new information was discussed yesterday, but my general feeling is maybe I'm naive, but I just don't see the like there's definitely a constituency on the board that feels that this is a long-term power play by the individuals who you know, put forward this plan. And so I won't name those elected officials who did that, but I guess I just don't see how that's possible. Like, you know, elected officials usually want to make decisions and make those decisions hold for the future. And this feels like what we should be wanting our elected officials to pass, right? To give us more community planning. So again, I missed yesterday. And so I know that there are a lot of people who are really skeptical of the process, like you mentioned, but I don't know. I feel like you said, if it's done in the right way, it's frankly a dream come true for our city. So I was going to say,
can I make a couple of thoughts on that?
Sure, absolutely. I guess what I'm worried is that we're going to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
That's a very good concern, because I think there's a high probability you're right about that. You know, which is part of the reason that my own thinking is just evolving even as I talk about it. Because the planning process I support. The desire to sort of look at citywide targets, I don't have a particular problem with that. I think it's probably likely beneficial. And what I guess I would actually like to see is a process. I have no problem with there being a citywide umbrella version of the process, as well as a locally driven version of the process, which might come out with very different pictures. That's fine too. So it's not the objectives of the process. It is the decision making and empowering of a particular position out of the process to come be the final arbiter of what's good and right and just and sustainable and consistent with city values. That frankly, my experience of the last 4 years and seeing what's going on in the White House makes me more mistrustful of that. I will say this: I don't think the process was developed out of ill will. As a little brother, I always had to try to understand how the bigger players in my family thought about things, and I still do. And my simple thought about that is, everyone in a particular process, you know, in the city political and economic and bureaucratic operation is a complex, you know, set of processes and operations. They try to do what makes sense and is rational from their point of view, and therefore I see goodwill in terms of the intent to create a process that will provide, you know, a frame of reference and an explicit set of values, and what that would imply in terms of the way, you know, planning and therefore ultimately decision making is done in the city. So all of that I could be totally subscribed to. If it did not, and this is where I do think it may not be intended to be a power play, but it will end up becoming one, because one person will be empowered to make the last decision. And I am very mistrustful now more than ever of what that's likely to mean in terms of what the values and pressures and interests are, impinging on that particular decision maker, in that particular position. And I don't think it's, I'm not against workers and I'm pro-union, I'm pro-workers, I'm pro all of that for the city. But I'm concerned about the degree to which in issues around development, that the economic interests of the developers and the economic interests of the suppliers to the development process are going to lead to development decisions, which I'll just say, try to be somewhat gentle, may or may not be in the interest of the local community. And I happen to have, where I live on 92nd New York, has one of the best views of the waste transfer station. You want to see the waste transfer station, come visit sometime. I've got a great view of it, and that again was where I think the value, certainly not interest of the Upper East Side, it was the values, and these are not bad values of something about, how to handle sanitation, which I think it actually does fairly efficiently. It is operating, I think, at 10% of capacity. So it was not necessarily an economically optimal decision. But it operates very well. The concern and impacts on the local community that we had have not evolved. I'm not concerned about, trucks coming and going. I'm not concerned about, volumes and capacity and traffic. But I do think that was a decision made not in the interest of the local community, and even questionable as to whether the actual decision was in the interest of the city citywide. And I apologize for that, but I'm just using it as an example of how decision-making go awry when it's concentrated by, a small number of decision makers in Lower Manhattan. And I probably went on too long, but
You said it, not me.
okay. Thank you, Diana.
I think I just want to move on in the agenda because I know Rami and Matthew have a resolution to propose related to school sports in high school. So I'm going to turn it over to Rami for that part.
Great. Thank you, Tina.
Yeah, so this was touched on briefly in Professor Klein's bit at the top of the meeting. But we've recently been seeing the real need for after school programs. And I notice how I call it after school and not extracurricular, because I think I've said it before, but I think that they're just as valuable as our in-class time. So recently, this has been dating pre-pandemic. This is going on for 3 odd years at this moment, but the Public School Athletic League governs school sports in high school. So schools can apply for a team. So let's say my new school wants a basketball team, we can apply, and the PSL commissioner and their whole system will maybe give me a team, and I'll play against other high schools in a league. So there's championships at the end. Some of those championship games, if you've ever seen, some of them wind up on like local TV. And some of these games are really where high school talent gets scouted by universities and institutes of higher education. And they're also a real paid outlet for staff. So a lot of coaches get paid to do with it, to coach a team. And it's not a small commitment if you've ever coached a team or met a coach. And it also gives the students an outlet to play. There are not a ton of leagues in the city because they, of course, cost money and they can be expensive. But having a high school league really benefits students and it benefits schools. And it's the last point I'll make here, and then I'll turn it over to Matthew, is that it's a recruiting tool for schools. So schools, especially new schools, they can use sports as recruiting tools. So they can say, hey, we have a top tier coach for our basketball team. We have top tier players. We want as many kids as we can apply to our school, and we're going to scout them out and see who's the real young talent that we can foster and really get into those top universities. So Matthew, I can keep going, but if you want me to talk about the problems that have been happening with, especially around Clinton.
I can speak to it if you'd like. So my name is Matthew Horovitz. I'm on the school leadership teams at Eleanor Roosevelt on East 76th Street and at the Clinton School on 15th Street. I'm a former Manhattan Borough president appointee to the CEC District 2. I'm just coming here to speak in favor of Rami's resolution. What he's talking about is how hard it is for schools to get PSAL teams for sports. As an example, Rami goes to Clinton. We have 500 kids there and 3 teams for girls and 1 team for boys, and that's for all 3 seasons combined. And when we've taught, this is the 3rd year of trying to get more sports, PSAL sports into Clinton. As an example, we're told over and over, the first new schools have to get in the back of the line. And then now we're told only underprivileged schools can get new PSAL teams. So it's a catch-22 for new schools trying to establish themselves. They can't get sports teams. And what they can't get also then oftentimes is boys, sporty boys, are alienated from a school where they can't play, and just athletes in general, girls also. My daughter plays soccer and they don't have a soccer team there. So it's very alienating in the admissions process to not have PSAL sports in a school. And I think what Rami's trying to do is open up the field, pardon the pun, to have the PSAL take more teams on. There's small schools that have been fighting for years and have been told, sorry, you're a new school, so you have to wait. But as an example, the 2 schools I'm on the school leadership team, they're equivalent size. They're both around 500 kids, and one has 20 PSAL teams and one has 4. So Elro has 20 sports teams, Clinton has 4. So it's time to really level the playing field and encourage the PSAL to charter more teams in its leagues. Thank you.
Yeah, so more specifically, so the PSAL has something called an all access policy, and we're still a little bit unclear about what the all access policy is, because it seems to change, as Matthew just said. It changes every time we email them. The wording of this resolution, Max, I don't know if you can share the screen, but
Sure.
We made it broad, so to make it a little bit across the board, because it's not just Clinton that's having this problem. It's all sorts of high schools across citywide, and so the real purpose of this resolution is really to get a little bit more movement and to say, hey, it's been 3 years, no movement. We've had the same 4 sports teams since the school was founded, and we've had significant demonstrated interest. We actually had a soccer team that was established for there's a recreational league that we paid out of pocket for at the end of the day. And that was unfair to both our school, which had that financial burden. It was also unfair to the students. Like, the students wanted to play in a PSAL regulated team where it's a really prompt environment that PSAL creates, and it's really powerful for students. So the resolution's up on the screen. It has a few clauses here, and I'll just go through them really quick. So the first part of the resolution talks about the importance of after-school programming, as I talked at the beginning of my introduction there. It also talks a little bit about COVID-19 and the effect on after-school programming overall. So there's been a lot of budget cuts, a lot of programs that haven't come back from the pandemic now that we're in this sort of weird phase, especially prior to summer rising and then this impending start of the 2021-22 school year. And it also recognizes the importance of school sports specifically to create that team environment, to have that learning opportunity. And then it talks a little bit more specifically about the All Access pilot program and the PSAL specifically, and its impact, really, because it hurts recruiting, it hurts school spirit, and it hurts the school, and it hurts students too. And so at the end of the day, the resolution is really calling for the repeal of this All Access pilot policy and the chartering of any sports team that has demonstrated interest. So For example, my school has demonstrated interest for soccer team for both boys and girls. So since we've demonstrated that interest, we feel that it should be chartered into the PSOL network. So I think I can open it up to discussion here.
Well, I'll wait 3 seconds and then I'll start talking. 1, 2, 3. Okay, my turn. I waited. Taina, I waited.
No, I know, go ahead.
Briefly, I mean, I'm hugely supportive of this, and I actually like the fact you included the language of after-school programs, not just athletic programs. I'm going to make, I don't know, a couple of quick comments. One is having been, at a school where I participated in sports every semester and was not, I shall say in an understated way, overly distinguished in my athletic capabilities. I felt that I learned probably more sort of relevant life skills, playing soccer, among other things, out on the playing fields than I did in the classroom. So I'm hugely supportive of that. I'm hugely supportive of other kinds of programs, whatever they may be. Chess in the schools being one. Teaching kids about entrepreneurship is one of the things I focus on, being another. So I totally support it, Rami and Matthew, and I appreciate your putting it on the agenda.
Thank you, Peter. Any other questions, comments, concerns? About PSAL or any of the things we discussed before? So if someone wants to call a question on this, that would be great.
I'll call the question.
Sure.
I think that's a second. Yep. Okay, so I'm gonna do some voting. So if you don't know, I think you all do, but if you're voting no, abstaining, or not voting for cause, raise your hand and we will record your vote. Seeing none, resolution passes unanimously. Thank you.
I just have to say who's here, although it's
I do, right.
But Taina, you can
go ahead. Go ahead.
Sure. Taina, Ed, Peter, and Rami.
And
Vanessa. And Vanessa. So sorry about that. Right in the corner. Sorry.
Thank you, Vanessa.
So for members of the public.
And thank you, Matthew.
Yep. Thank you, Matthew. It's going to go up to full board in June. Max, what's our meeting date for June?
I think the 17th, but I'm looking right now to confirm.
Yeah, so sometime around then, probably the 2nd or 16th. 16th of June, and then from there, things happen. So hopefully things happen. So I hope to see everyone again there for this resolution, and I'll pass it back to Taina if you have anything else.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you so much. No, I think unless there are any new business or old business items, I think we are set for the evening.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Awesome.
Yeah, I got my resolution passed. Just a different resolution.
Yeah.
Thanks,
have a good night, everyone.
You too.
Thank you all. Thank you, Vanessa. Thanks, Max. See you, Ed. Bye-bye.